Moreover, the local IBM princes and barons were eager to view the new leader. So the day after the annual meeting, I flew to France to meet with the mightiest of all nobles, IBM Europe, Middle East, and Africa, we call it EMEA. I visited France, Italy, Germany, and the United Kingdom, all in 1 week. It was dawn to midnight business reviews with senior executives, employee town hall meetings, and customer visits. IBM EMEA was a giant organization operating in 44 countries with more than 90,000 employees. Revenue had peaked at $27 billion in 1990 and had declined since. Gross profit margin on hardware had dropped from 56% in 1990 to 38% in 1992. Very important was the fact that in the face of this huge decline in gross profits, total expenses had dropped only $700 million. Pre-tax profit margin had declined from 18% in 1990 to 6% in 1992. Wherever I went, the business message was the same: rapidly declining mainframe sales, much higher prices than those of our competitors, a lack of participation in the rapidly growing client, server, PC-centric segment, and an alarming decline in the company's image. One of the most disturbing statements in my advance reading material was, "We estimate our net cash change at negative $800 million in 1993. We expect to be self-funding but will not be able for some time to pay dividends to the corporation." While I learned a lot on this trip, the meetings with customers were particularly useful. Perhaps the most important messages were internal. It was clear that at all levels of the organization there was fear, uncertainty, and an extraordinary preoccupation with internal processes as the cause of our problems and, therefore, a belief that tinkering with the processes would provide the solutions we needed. There were long discussions of transfer pricing between units, alternative divisions of authority, and other intramural matters. When EMEA executives summarized their action program for the company, number 1 was, use country as prime point of optimization. I returned home with a healthy appreciation of what I had been warned to expect: powerful geographic fiefdoms with duplicate infrastructure in each country. Of the 90,000 EMEA employees, 23,000 were in support functions. I also came away with an understanding that these were enormously talented people, a team as deeply committed and competent as I had ever seen in any organization. I reached this conclusion repeatedly over the next few months. On the flight home I asked myself, how could such truly talented people allow themselves to get into such a morass? The clique heard round the world, as Paul Rizzo had said in our secret meeting in Washington, D.C., IBM's sustainability, at least in the short term, depended heavily on the mainframe. More than 90% of the company's profits came from these large servers and the software that ran on them. It didn't take a Harvard MBA or a McKinsey consultant to understand that the fate of the mainframe was the fate of IBM, and, at the time, both were sinking like stones. One of the first meetings I asked for was a briefing on the state of this business. I remember at least 2 things about that first meeting. With Nick Donofrio, who was then running the System/390 business. One is that I drove to his office in Somers, New York, about 15 miles north of Armonk, and experienced a repeat of my first day on the job. Once again, I found myself lacking a badge to open the doors. At this complex, which housed the staffs of all of IBM's major product groups, and nobody there knew who I was. I finally persuaded some kind soul to let me in, found Nick, and we got started. Sort of. At that time, the standard format of any important IBM meeting was a presentation using overhead projectors and graphics on transparencies that IBMers called, and no one remembers why, foils. Nick was on his second foil when I stepped to the table and, as politely as I could in front of his team, switched off the projector. After a long moment of awkward silence, I simply said, "Let's just talk about your business." I mention this episode because it had an unintended, but terribly powerful ripple effect. By that afternoon an email about my hitting the off button on the overhead projector was crisscrossing the world. Talk about consternation. It was as if the President of the United States had banned the use of English at White House meetings. By the way, in the telling of that story, I'm in no way suggesting that Nick didn't know his business. In many ways he was the godfather of the technology that would end up saving the IBM mainframe, and his strong technical underpinnings, combined with his uncanny ability to translate technical complexities into common language, were a great source of reassurance to me in the days ahead. We had a great meeting, and there is a straight line between what I Heard that day and one early major decision at IBM. The mainframe decision in a subsequent meeting in the conference room near my office in Armonk. The mainframe team documented a rapid decline in sales and, more important, a precipitous drop in market share in the last 15 months. I asked why we were losing so much share, and the answer was, Hitachi, Fujitsu, and Amdal are pricing 30 to 40% below our price. I asked the obvious, why don't we lower our prices so they don't keep beating us like a drum? The answer, we would lose substantial revenues and profits at a time when we need profits badly. I had hoped to follow the advice of all the management gurus and try to avoid making major decisions in the first 90 days, but that only happens in guru world. The company was hemorrhaging, and at the heart of it was the System/390 mainframe. But almost immediately after joining the company, I had to do something. It became clear to me at that point that the company, either consciously or unconsciously, was milking the S/390 and that the business was on a path to die. I told the team that, effective immediately, the milking strategy was over and instructed them to get back to me with an aggressive price reduction plan that we could announce 2 weeks later at a major customer conference. The financial people gulped hard. There was no doubt that a new CEO could take the alternative strategy, keep S/390 prices high for a number of years, since it wasn't easy for customers to shift to competitive products in the near future. The revenue, hundreds of millions of dollars, would have been a powerful short-term underpinning of a restructuring of the company. But it would also have been painful for customers and contrary to what they were pleading with us to do, which was to fix the problem rather than walk away from it. Over the longer term, we would have destroyed the company's greatest asset, and perhaps the company itself. So we made a bet on a dramatic price reduction on the product that produced virtually all of IBM's profit. We made another important decision that day, or, better said, I reaffirmed an important decision that had been made a number of months before I'd arrived. The technical team in the 390 division had staked out a bold move to a totally different technical architecture for the System/390, to move from what was known as a bipolar to CMOS, pronounced CMOS, technology. If this enormously complex project could be pulled off, it would permit substantial price reductions in the S/390 without commensurate loss in gross profit, thus improving dramatically the competitiveness of the S/390 versus alternative products. If the project failed, the 390 was dead. But it didn't fail. And the technical wizards from labs in Europe and the United States who pulled it off deserve a place among the heroes of the new IBM. I have always been thankful and lucky that some insightful people had made that decision before I'd arrived. My job was simply to reaffirm it and to protect the $1 billion we would spend on it over the next 4 years. I am convinced that had we not made the decision to go with CMOS, we'd have been out of the mainframe business by 1997. In fact, that point has been proven more or less by what happened to our principal competitor at the time, Hitachi. It continued development of bigger and bigger bipolar systems, but that technology eventually ran out of gas, and Hitachi is no longer in this business. The CMOS performance curve was staggering on paper, and it didn't disappoint us. We're building bigger, more powerful systems today than anyone ever dreamed about with bipolar technology. So, if you want to think about the return on the $1 billion investment we made back in the early 1990s, I think one fair measure is high-end server revenue from 1997 forward, $19 billion through the end of 2001. The first strategy conference on Sunday, May 16, I convened a 2-day internal meeting on corporate strategy at a conference center in Chantilly, Virginia. There were 26 senior IBM executives present. Dress was casual, but the presentations were both formal and formidable. I was totally exhausted at the end. It was truly like drinking from a fire hose. The technical jargon, the abbreviations, and the arcane terminology were by themselves enough to wear anyone down. But what was really draining was the recognition that while the people in the room were extremely bright, very committed, and, at times, quite convinced of what needed to be done, there was little true strategic underpinning for the strategies discussed. Not once was the question of customer segmentation raised. Rarely did we compare our offerings to those of our competitors. There was no integration across the various topics that allowed the group to pull together a total IBM view. I was truly confused, and that may have been the real low point of my first year at IBM.